She was 21 years old. She had $11 in her coat pocket, and she was standing in front of a houseboat that hadn't moved in 14 years. The sign nailed to the dock post said for sale, $8. No reasonable offers refused. Someone had crossed out reasonable with a black marker and written any above it. Below that, in smaller letters, a previous owner had added, "Do not ask about the lights. We want to tell you about Margot Fenwick, about what she found on that dock in the autumn, and what it cost her, and what it gave back." Margot Fenwick was born in late October in a farmhouse outside of Truro, Nova Scotia, the kind of house where the wind found every gap between the clapboards and the winter settled in like an unwanted relative who had nowhere else to go. Her mother, Louise Fenwick, had been a woman of considerable warmth and very little patience for things that couldn't be fixed with either a strong cup of tea or a sharp pair of scissors. She kept a garden that produced more than 2 people could eat and gave the rest away without ceremony. She laughed easily. She died of a stroke when Margot was 9 years old, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, with her rubber boots still on. After that, the house changed in the way houses change when the person who gave them their character is suddenly gone. Her father, Gerald Fenwick, was not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had built his entire interior life around one other person. And when that person was gone, there was nothing left to build on. He went back to work at the mill. He came home. He ate what Margot made, which in the beginning was mostly toast and canned soup, and later, as she taught herself, became more. He said thank you in the distracted way of someone remembering a word from a foreign language they hadn't spoken in years. When Margot was 14, he remarried. Her name was Constance, and she came from Antigonish, with 2 opinions about everything and a particular dislike for clutter. Margot's books were clutter. Margot's clay-stained hands were clutter. Margot herself was, in the careful arithmetic of Constance's world, an inconvenience that predated her and therefore couldn't be returned. But none of that is where this story truly begins. It begins in a workshop behind a salt-weathered house on the edge of town, with a woman named Philippa Rowe. Philippa Rowe was 63 years old and had been working with copper since she was younger than Margot. She was a silversmith and a coppersmith, and, when the mood took her, a maker of small iron hinges and hand-forged hooks that she sold to heritage restoration projects across the Maritimes. She had no children of her own, no apprentices on record, and a disposition that most people in town described as not unfriendly, once you understand her. She had noticed Margot the way certain people notice certain children, quietly, from a distance, with a kind of recognition that doesn't need explaining. One afternoon when Margot was 15 and sitting on a fence post near Philippa's property, watching the workshop door the way a person watches a fire, Philippa came out, looked at her directly, and said, "Can you hold a file steady?" Margot said she thought she probably could. Philippa said, "Come in then." What followed was 6 years of education that no school would have offered and no certificate would ever acknowledge. Philippa taught Margot how to anneal copper, how to feel the moment the metal softened under the torch without watching the color change. She taught her the difference between a raising hammer and a planishing hammer, and why it mattered. She showed her how to read a piece of raw stock the way a woodworker reads grain. Not with the eyes first, but with the fingertips. She taught her to make rivets and to set them clean, to solder a joint so fine it disappeared into the seam. She also taught her, without ever saying so directly, that competence was the most reliable form of dignity, that knowing how to do a thing well, and doing it, was an answer to almost everything the world might say about you. For her 20th birthday, Philippa gave Margot a small chasing hammer she had forged herself. The handle was wrapped in worn leather that had gone soft and dark with years of use. The head was perfectly balanced, heavy enough to move metal, light enough to control. Margot had held many of Philippa's tools. This one fit differently. It fit the way a thing fits when it was made with you specifically in mind. Philippa died the following spring, unexpectedly and without much warning, the way practical women sometimes do, in the middle of getting something done. A heart attack, in the workshop, on a Wednesday morning in April. She left the workshop and its contents to a heritage foundation, which was entirely in keeping with her character. She left Margot a note, 3 sentences long, which said, "You know what you need to know. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The hammer is yours." Margot kept the hammer. The day she was asked to leave her father's house was a Saturday in late September, 3 weeks after Philippa's funeral. She had come downstairs to find Constance at the kitchen table with a manila envelope, which she slid across the surface, with the manner of someone completing an administrative task that had been pending for some time. Inside was a folded letter and a bus schedule. The letter was practical. It said that Margot was 21 now, that the spare room was needed, and that there was a shelter in Dartmouth that accepted young women for up to 30 days. It said this was not personal. Her father was in the living room. She could hear the television. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the back of his chair and the back of his head and the way neither of them moved. She folded the letter, put it in her pocket, picked up her bag, which she had, without quite knowing why, packed 2 days earlier, as if some part of her had understood what was coming, and she left. She did not go to the shelter in Dartmouth. She had been walking for perhaps an hour when she found herself at the water. It was a river estuary, wide and slow, and the color of pewter in the overcast afternoon light. A gravel road ran along the bank, and at the end of it, half obscured by a stand of alder, was a dock. And at the dock, sitting very low and very still in the water, was the houseboat. We should tell you what it looked like because it matters. It was roughly 40 feet long, and perhaps 12 feet wide, which sounds large until you saw how much of that length was occupied by a warped deck and a collapsed section at the bow. The cabin structure itself was intact, cedar siding gone gray and mossy, 2 small windows with intact glass, a wood stove chimney that had grown a small colony of lichen near the cap. The hull appeared to be solid, an old steel pontoon design, the kind built to last and then forgotten about. The waterline was stained but even. It was sitting the way things sit when they are structurally sound and aesthetically defeated. The sign on the dock post told the price and the warning. Margot stood there for a long time. She had $11. She had Philippa's hammer in the side pocket of her bag, wrapped in a piece of chamois cloth. She had a change of clothes, a tin of sardines, a small roll of copper wire she'd been carrying since she left the workshop because she hadn't known what else to take, and a copy of a field guide to Nova Scotia birds that had been her mother's. She thought about the sign. Do not ask about the lights. She went to find whoever had put it there. The man she found was named Bertrand Okafor, and he was the land agent for the county, which in this stretch of river meant he was responsible for about a dozen properties that no one else wanted to think about. He was somewhere in his late 50s with the specific kind of tired that comes from decades of practical work, and he looked at Margot the way Mr. Abernathy might have looked at Eliza. Not unkindly, but not expectantly, either. You're not asking about the lights, he said, before she could speak. I'm asking about the price, she said. He looked at her. He looked at her bag. He closed the folder he'd been writing in. The county wants $8 to clear it off the register. Nobody's paid the mooring fee in 14 years. The foundation is sound. I had it inspected, because I always do, but the deck needs replacing and the cabin interior is, he paused, considered by some to be uninhabitable. By some, she said. By the 2 people who tried to live there and left within a season. Margot thought of what Philippa had said once about a piece of copper she'd been offered that had been sitting in a shed for 20 years. Neglect isn't damage, she'd said. Neglect is just time without attention. The material underneath is often fine. I have $11, she said. I'll pay the 8 and use the rest to start. Bertrand Okafor looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened his folder again and said, I'll need a name for the deed, she told him. He wrote it down, and Margot Fenwick spent 3 of her remaining dollars on a new pen nib and a spiral notebook at the corner store because she understood even then that what was coming would need to be documented. We should talk about the lights, because you're wondering. The first time Margot saw them, she had been living aboard for 11 days. She had replaced the worst of the deck planks with lumber she'd scavenged from a pile behind the county road yard. She'd asked Bertrand Okafor first, and he'd said with a wave of his hand, take what you need. She had recalked the deck seams with oakum she found in a can in the cabin's small hold, sealing the gaps with the careful patience Philippa had taught her to bring to any material that needed coaxing. She had cleaned the wood stove and tested the chimney draw, and confirmed that the stove, at least, was in perfect working order. She had not yet opened the hatch in the cabin floor. She had noticed it on the first day. A trapdoor about 2 feet square, set into the floorboards near the bow end of the cabin, with a small iron ring handle. She had tugged it once, found it swollen shut with moisture, and left it. There were other things to do first. The deck, the caulking, the broken catch on the starboard window. There was a logic to repair, Philippa had always said, and the logic was this. You work from outside in, from structural to finishing, from what threatens the whole to what threatens only the comfort. You do not begin in the middle. But on the 11th night, Margot woke at 2 a.m. to a faint greenish light seeping up from the edges of the hatch. She lay still and looked at it for a long time. She was not by nature a person who frightened easily. She was a person who had spent years working near open flames with metal that could burn through a hand in a second if you misjudged it. And she had learned that the correct response to something unexpected was not panic but attention. You looked at it. You tried to understand what it actually was before you decided how to feel about it. The light pulsed slowly. It was not electric. It had the quality of something biological. Bioluminescence, she thought, the word surfacing from some long ego science class. She got up. She knelt by the hatch and pulled at the iron ring, and this time, perhaps because the wood had dried somewhat in the weeks she'd been running the stove, it opened. Below was the bilge space, perhaps 2.5 feet deep, accessible by a short ladder. And in the bilge, partially submerged in a few inches of standing water that had collected there over years, was a glass jar. The lid was sealed with wax. Inside the jar, glowing with a cold and steady greenish light, was a quantity of water that was clearly not ordinary water. Beside the jar, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tied with tarred twine, was a package. She climbed down the ladder. The water was cold around her feet. She picked up the bar first, held it up, turned it. The light inside shifted like something living. She set it on the ladder step and took the package. She climbed back up into the cabin, latched the hatch, and sat on the floor with the oilcloth bundle in her lap and her heart doing something complicated in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but something between the two that had no common name. She cut the twine with the small knife she kept on her belt. She peeled back the oilcloth layers. Inside was a logbook. A proper ship's log, the kind with a cloth cover reinforced at the corners, the kind they had stopped making in the way she was looking at perhaps 60 years ago. Beneath the logbook was a small chamois pouch tied shut, and beneath that, folded in a piece of silk that had once been vivid blue and was now the color of a winter sky, was a letter. She opened the letter first. The handwriting was a sailor's hand. Precise, economical. The letters formed with the efficiency of someone who had written many things in difficult conditions. It began without preamble. To whoever opens this hold. My name is Vivienne Arsenault. I built this boat in 1958 with my husband, Patrick, and our son, Luke, who was then 8 years old. We lived aboard for 6 years, traveling the river and the coast of this province, and they were the best years of any of our lives. Patrick died of cancer in 1964. Luke grew up and moved to Vancouver, and I do not blame him for it. I lived aboard alone for another 11 years, until the winter of 1975, when I understood that I could no longer manage the physical demands of maintaining a boat by myself. Before I left, I hid the things that mattered most to me here, in the hold, because I could not bear to take them somewhere landbound, and I could not bear to leave them where they might be found by someone who did not understand what they were. The jar contains water from the phosphorescent bay at Newfoundland's Marischine Cove, collected on the last night of a journey Patrick and I took in 1961. It is ordinary seawater that contains an extraordinary quantity of bioluminescent organisms. I know that after 50 years they cannot still be alive, and yet, it still glows. I have no explanation for this. Neither did the 2 marine biologists I eventually wrote to ask. The pouch contains my earnings. I made custom navigational instruments, compasses, clinometers, hand-bearing devices, for private vessels and heritage foundations. I was good at it. I saved carefully. What is in the pouch is $460 in bills, and a cashier's check made out to no one in particular, which should still be negotiable. I am leaving this because I could not carry it and because I want it to go to someone who needs a beginning. Not someone who wants a boat to sell. Not someone looking for scrap value. Someone who will fix what needs fixing and live here and make it into something again. If you are that person, the money is yours, with one condition. The logbook is Patrick's. It contains the account of every journey we made together. I have read it so many times I have it more or less memorized. I do not need it anymore, but I want it to stay with the boat. Please keep it on board. One more thing, the light in the jar. I know it makes no scientific sense, but Patrick always said it was a good omen, a thing that gave light without fire, without cost, without diminishing. I think that is what this boat can be for you if you let it. Make something here. That is all I ask. Vivienne Arsenault. October 1975. Margot sat on the floor of the cabin for a very long time after she finished reading. Outside, the river moved past in the dark, its sound low and continuous, the way the sound of moving water always is, a kind of patient company. She thought about Philippa, who had also put her faith in someone younger and believed it would be well placed. She thought about her father, in his living room, with the television on, the back of his head never turning. She thought about what Constance had handed her across the kitchen table with the efficiency of a woman clearing an account. And then she stopped thinking and simply sat with the weight of what had been given to her. The impossible glowing jar, the logbook, the pouch with its quiet small fortune, and let it settle. She was not an intruder. She was, in the most unexpected and unearned way, exactly the person Vivian had been hoping for. In the morning, she began. The money changed the scope of what was possible without changing the shape of the work. That is an important distinction. She did not go into town and hire someone. She was not that kind of person, and this was not that kind of project. But she was able to buy the materials she needed without rationing them, and that changed the pace considerably. The deck came first, as it had to. She pulled up the worst of the remaining planks, more than she had initially thought, and spent 4 days laying new decking in a pattern she had seen in a photograph of a restored Great Lakes vessel, alternating the board widths for stability. It was hard physical labor, the kind that required the whole body. She got better at it as the days went on. By the 4th day, her hands had stopped blistering and started simply aching in the clean way that good work produces. She found Bartholomew Keynes through Bertrand Okafor, who mentioned him with the particular casualness of someone who has been waiting for the right moment to mention something. Bartholomew Keynes was 70 years old and had spent 35 of those years as a marine engineer on the St. Lawrence Seaway before retiring to this stretch of the Nova Scotia River, because his wife had grown up here and had wanted to come home. His wife had died 4 years ago. He spent his mornings at the river. He appeared at the dock one morning without announcement, stood on the bank, and looked at the boat the way a doctor looks at a patient, not unkindly, but assessingly. "Bertrand says you're fixing her up," he said. "I am," Margot said, from her position on her knees by the stern rail. "What do you know about steel pontoon hulls?" "Less than I'd like to," she said honestly. He nodded, as if this was the right answer. "I'll come have a look at the underside if you want. There's a way to inspect the hull integrity from the dock with a long-handle mirror. I have one." He came the next morning with the mirror and a notebook and a thermos of coffee. He inspected the hull with the methodical care of someone who has inspected many hulls and understands that the things you cannot see are the things that sink you. He found 2 areas of surface rust that needed treating and 1 small section near the bow that required a plate weld. "I can do the weld," he said. "I have the equipment." "It's not charity," he added before she could speak. "I've been looking for a reason to get the welding rig out of the garage for 2 years. My son thinks I should sell it." Margot looked at him. "How does your son feel about you being right?" A smile came onto Bartholomew Keynes's face that looked like it had been waiting some time for the right context. "He's had some opportunity to get used to it," he said. She liked him immediately. He reminded her of Philippa, not in manner, which was different, but in the quality of attention he brought to materials. He understood metal the way Philippa had understood metal, as a thing with its own logic, its own requirements, its own way of failing if you didn't respect it. He welded the bow plate over 2 afternoons, and while he worked, he talked about the St. Lawrence, about the way ice behaves on moving water, about the particular challenges of a timber and steel hybrid construction, which this boat was. Margot listened and asked questions and took notes in her spiral notebook, the one she'd bought with 3 of her last dollars on the day she got the deed. In exchange, she showed him what she knew about copper. She had brought her tools aboard by then, the full kit from Philippa's workshop that the Heritage Foundation had allowed her to take, since they had no use for working tools, only for display items. She was making a set of small hand-bearing compasses, the kind Vivienne Arsenault had described making in her letter, partly because the work suited the space, and partly because it felt like the right kind of continuity. Bartholomew Keynes watched her work on a compass housing one afternoon, the chasing hammer moving in the precise rhythmic way Philippa had spent years teaching her, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Who taught you that?" She told him about Philippa. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," he said. "She was," Margot said. "She was the kind of person who made you better just by taking you seriously." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife was like that," he said. He said it simply, without making anything more of it, and Margot understood that the simplicity was the whole point. They worked alongside each other after that in the comfortable way of people who have found they can occupy the same space without friction. The community at the river came slowly, the way communities come when the people in them are watchful and have been let down before and take their time about trust. The first to cross was a woman named Tilda Marchmont, who lived in the farmhouse at the top of the gravel road and had been watching the smoke from the stove chimney every morning with the specific interest of someone who had watched that chimney not smoke for 14 years. She appeared at the dock one day with a jar of bake-apple preserves and the manner of someone doing reconnaissance. "You're the one who bought it," she said. "I am," said Margot. "For $8. "Yes." Tilda Marchmont considered this. She was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that had clearly been beautiful in youth and was now, in age, something more interesting than beautiful. "I've been looking at that boat for 14 years, she said. "My late husband always said someone would come along and know what to do with it." "Did he say who?" "He said someone young and either foolish or very determined, because those are the only kinds of people who take on projects like this." She held out the preserves. "Bake-apple from my bog, thank you," Margot said. "Don't thank me. It's an excuse to be nosy." But she was smiling when she said it, and the smile stayed. Tilda became a regular presence at the dock, arriving most afternoons with something. Bread, or smoked fish, or once, inexplicably, a small lamp that she said she didn't need, and that Margot should have for the cabin, and which was perfect in the cabin, which she hadn't said. She was a woman who communicated primarily through objects, and Margot, who had grown up in a house where affection worked the same way, understood this without needing it explained. Bertrand Okafor stopped by one afternoon, in his official capacity, which appeared to mean he walked along the bank and called out, "How's it coming?" and then stayed for an hour. He had known Vivienne Arsenault, he told Margot. Not well, but enough. She was very self-contained, he said. The kind of person you respected from a distance because you could tell she didn't need anything from you, but you suspected she was extraordinary. She was, Margot said, and was surprised to find that she meant it, about a woman she had never met. What happened to her? After she left the boat. Bertrand shook his head. "I heard she went west. British Columbia, maybe. I don't know if she's still alive. She'd be in her 90s now." He looked at the boat, at the new decking bright against the old trim. "I think she'd be glad," he said, "about all this." By November, the cabin interior was done. She had kept it simple. A built-in bunk with storage beneath, a small table bolted to the wall, 2 folding chairs, the wood stove with a new flue section that Bartholomew had helped her install. She had built a copper-edged mirror frame that caught the light and moved it around the space. She had added a narrow shelf for her tools, and on the shelf, in the place where things of particular significance live, she set 2 objects side by side. One was Philippa's chasing hammer, its leather handle worn to the specific patina of a tool that has been used, and used well, and loved in the way that useful things deserve to be loved. It was the proof that someone had seen her, had believed in what she could become, and had given her the means to become it. The other was the glass jar from the bilge. It still glowed, soft and greenish and impossible. Patrick Arsenault's good omen. Vivienne's strange and beautiful inheritance. She had, after much thought, also propped Patrick's logbook on the shelf beside them. She read a few pages of it sometimes in the evenings, not all the way through. It wasn't hers to read all at once, but enough to know that what he and Vivienne had made together on this boat had been real and particular and worth preserving. The first snow came in early December, a light dry snow that settled on the new deck and made it look clean and quiet and prepared. Inside the cabin, the wood stove ran steady and low, and the smell was of cedar and iron and the faint metallic warmth of copper work. Margot was at the small table, finishing the last of the compass housings she'd been working on, when she heard a knock at the hull. A specific knock, 2 short and 1 long, which was what Bartholomew Keynes had established as his standard greeting when he came along the dock. "Come in," she called. He came in with his thermos and sat in one of the folding chairs and looked at the compass housing she was working on. He watched her for a while. "Someone from the Heritage Restoration Project in Lunenburg called Bertrand," he said, asking about the boat, whether it was available. Margot kept working. "What did Bertrand tell them?" "He told them it had been sold and was in good hands." Bartholomew paused. "He also mentioned that the person who bought it made custom navigational instruments. He might have given them your name." Margot set down the hammer. She looked at what she had made. The compass housing, bright and precise, the needle mount centered correctly, the engraving around the dial clean and even. "Vivienne did this," she said. "Made compasses. For heritage projects." "I know," he said. "Bertrand told me. He thought you'd find it interesting." She found it considerably more than interesting. She found it the kind of thing that could not have been planned, and could not, therefore, be attributed to anything less than the specific and patient arrangement of consequences over time. What Philippa would have called the logic of materials, and what her mother, in her rubber boots in the garden, would have called the way things go when you let them. "I'll write to them," she said. "Good," said Bartholomew. He poured 2 cups from the thermos. Outside, the snow came down on the river, and the river kept moving, as it always had, past the dock and the boat, and the two lit windows and out toward the dark estuary and the sea. It was warm inside. It was hers. Margot Fenwick had come to that dock with $11 and a hammer, and the understanding, hard-won and bone-deep, that a person is capable of more than the circumstances of their leaving would suggest. She had found in a hull everyone else had written off the remains of another woman's extraordinary life, and the means, and the charge, to build one of her own. The boat that had been called the Arsenault wreck, the liability, the thing nobody wanted, was now known along the river simply as Margot's boat. People gave directions by it. They said, follow the road past the old Keynes property, turn at the alder stand, and you'll see the smoke from the chimney. She had a name. She had a place. And we'll leave you with this. Somewhere in your life, and we suspect you already know where, there is a thing others have given up on that is waiting for someone to see the good bones. What have you found? Or what do you think is waiting for you, in a place or a person that the world had already written off?